The first thing that comes to our mind when the word Holocaust strikes is Auschwitz, gas chambers, and the concentration camps of Nazis in Germany and Poland. The places have grown in the heart of our conscience as a symbol of unimaginable sufferings, a systematic genocide that resulted in the loss of millions of lives. Those camps are recounted in schools, discussed in documentaries, and are sobering reminders of what happens when hate is allowed to take hold. But what if I said there was another chapter to that dark history, one mostly unspoken, barely taught, and most often overlooked? It is a chapter that appeared not in the concentration camps so notorious in Western Europe, but in towns, villages, and ravines of Ukraine, where one of the most cruel and terrifying secrets of the Holocaust has remained well concealed to this date, buried under varnish of history and silence. It tells the story of mass graves hidden in forests, whole communities wiped out in a matter of hours, and of a systematic genocide that was carried out openly, often with the active collaboration of local people. Today, we expose the secret, unspoken history of the Holocaust in Ukraine. A tragedy that has kept silent for decades, yet deserves to be remembered and recognized. These chronicles are not a retelling of the past, but cautionary tales about the times to come, revealing how low humanity can fall when prejudice, authority, and manipulation are mixed in an incredibly lethal dose. In comprehending these events, we are not merely paying our respects to the victims, but forcing ourselves to confront the gruesome reality of how rapidly hate and authoritarianism can bring a civilization to its knees. In World War II, Ukraine got entangled in the war between the two most repressive regimes at that time, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Before the Nazi invasion, Ukraine had already suffered a lot under the Soviet regime. Stalin's collectivization policy imposed a man-made famine called the Holodomor upon the Ukrainians in the early 1930s, which took away the lives of millions. Whole families died from hunger, and anyone who resisted such seizure of harvests was immediately branded as enemies of the state. This era of suffering was followed by what is known as Stalin's Great Purge, a movement against intellectuals, members of religious groups, military personnel, and anyone perceived as a threat to Soviet power. The purges separated families, devastated communities, and created an overwhelming atmosphere of fear and mistrust. But in 1941, everything changed again. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion ever, Ukraine became one of the major theaters of war. Within weeks, the Nazis had overrun much of Ukrainian territory, bringing with them not only war, but also their genocide agenda. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, or living space, saw Ukraine as a country ready to be occupied by Germans. The rich lands of Ukraine were considered Europe's breadbasket, and the Third Reich coveted its resources. For the Nazis, Ukraine represented more than just a strategic acquisition. It was also a place where their racial policies could be put into practice on an unparalleled level. One of the most important targets for Hitler was the Jewish population of Ukraine. Before the war, over 2.7 million Jews were residing in Ukraine, mostly in small towns called shtetls. These were tight communities that had long formed vibrant centers of Jewish life, replete with synagogues, schools, marketplaces, and traditions passed down through generations. The shtetls played a significant role in the cultural heritage of Ukraine, but for the Nazis, they represented an obstacle to their vision of a racially pure empire. It was not an attempt to regulate the region, as it had been in many other instances, but rather a systematic move to clear its land of complete sets of people. Unlike the organized mass killings seen in the concentration camps of Western Europe, the Holocaust in Ukraine was done in a rather more direct and brutal manner. The Nazis employed mobile killing squads, known as the Einsatzgruppen. These groups consisted of SS officers, police units, and local supporters tasked with eliminating Jews, Romani individuals, communists, and anyone else deemed undesirable by the Third Reich. Their methods were horribly personal. The Einsatzgruppen would descend upon towns and villages, round up the Jewish population, and march them to the outskirts of the community. There, the victims had to dig their graves or were taken to nearby gorges. Following this, they were shot one by one in a line. This form of genocide was what they termed the Holocaust by bullets. It was personal and incomprehensibly inhumane, because the executioners faced their victims right in front of them before pulling the trigger. The psychological burden on the executioners was immense, though it paled in comparison to the fear experienced by the victims. Whole families, mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, were gathered and executed together, the bodies thrown onto mass graves that were quickly covered over. To the victims, there was no chance to plead, no possibility of running away, just the cruel mechanical fact of death. Probably one of the best-known cases of the Holocaust by bullets in Ukraine was a slaughter that occurred in Babi Yar, a deep gully situated near the city of Kiev. During the last week of September 1941, a terrible order from the Nazis circulated. All Kiev Jews should present themselves at some place, their belongings not excluded. Without knowing their fate, the victims sincerely believed they were about to be transported. Instead, they were taken to Babi Yar and, after being forced to undress, were killed individually at the edge of the gorge. In 2 days, more than 33,000 men, women, and children were executed. The corpses lay in the gorge, one atop another. The slaughter did not stop there. In the next 2 years, Babi Yar continued to be a place of slaughter for other groups: Soviet POWs, Roma people, and political adversaries of all kinds. The number of victims at the end of the war was estimated to be more than 100,000. While the massacre at Babi Yar was hugely horrific, it was very much minimized over many decades, especially during Soviet rule, which gave prominence to the collective sufferings of Soviet citizens without acknowledging the peculiar persecutions against Jews. Although the Nazis orchestrated the Holocaust, they frequently depended on local collaborators to implement their strategies. In Ukraine, not only police and militia, but even ordinary citizens were mobilized for the apprehension of Jews and to keep tabs on them, and in some cases, for the killing. Many motives compelled people to collaborate: deep-seated anti-Semitic convictions for some, fear of German retaliation, and hopes for financial gain for others. Following the massacres, Jewish houses and possessions were pillaged, with neighbors seizing what had been abandoned. This history of collaboration remains an acutely sensitive and controversial topic in Ukraine. Though thousands of Ukrainians opposed the Nazis and courageously fought in the Red Army, the role of others in the Holocaust muddies the country's historical narrative. Such uncomfortable realities have fired continuous discussions about how Ukraine ought to acknowledge and come to terms with this troubling period in its history. Unlike the concentration camps that left physical structures to stand in testimony to the Holocaust by bullets in Ukraine left behind mass graves scattered across the countryside. Many of these were hastily covered, with perhaps only a few survivors or witnesses knowing where the locations of some of these mass graves were. Many of these sites remained unknown for decades, their stories untold. During Soviet times, the Holocaust in Ukraine was mostly wiped out of popular memory. In those places where monuments did exist, the victims were referred to as peaceful Soviet citizens, with a clear and deliberate avoidance of any mention of Jewish victims. In recent years, forgotten graves have been unearthed, and the stories of victims recorded. Groups like Yahad in Unum, under the leadership of Father Patrick Desbois, have made immense efforts to identify places of mass graves, interview witnesses, and reveal these blind spots in history. Their studies have exposed the enormity of the atrocities, identifying thousands of mass burial sites across Ukraine. Each site tells a story of lives cut short, of communities destroyed, and of wounds that will never heal. The Holocaust in Ukraine continues to resonate today in the identity of the nation and its relationship with history. For many years, the atrocities committed on Ukrainian soil were enveloped by the greater narrative of World War II. Only more recently has there been a greater drive to confront and acknowledge this painful history. Such consideration has not come without controversy. The participation of collaborators, the omission of Jewish suffering during Soviet times, and the rise of nationalist movements all have sparked debate over how Ukraine should remember its past. At the same time, there has developed an awareness of the need to preserve Holocaust sites and educate future generations about those atrocities that did happen. Memorials and educational programs today strive to keep the stories of victims from oblivion. That has nothing to do with history, but provides the opportunity to understand where hate leads in order for such crimes not to be repeated. The Holocaust in Ukraine serves as a stern warning of the perils of bias, misinformation, and unchecked authority. This is a story that must be told, not only for the victims, but for the sake of mankind. By understanding the evils of history, we would be better prepared to identify and stand against forces that enable such tragedy to take place. As we reveal the most hidden secret of Ukraine, we remember those murdered by encouraging their stories to continue living. History might have swept it under the carpet, but somehow, the truth will always find its way out. These testimonies are hard to hear, but they are a part of understanding the full scale of the Holocaust and its enduring impact on the world. The Holocaust in Ukraine is the most shocking and at the same time underreported story of the Second World War. From the massacres in Babi Yar to the unmarked graves scattered all over the countryside, this tragedy is a grim reminder of how cruel humanity can be. By giving light to this dark history, we pay our respects to the victims and are also made to face uncomfortable truths of the past. While it might be painful to listen to such accounts, these are very significant for a complete understanding of the Holocaust and its persisting existence in the world.